So I want to welcome everybody today to this travel presentation, Traveling Savvy, How to Stay Safe While Exploring the World. These are interesting times in which we find ourselves in. And I want to talk mostly today about ways to be safe. A lot of this has to do with COVID because that's what we're dealing with for the most part these days. If otherwise, we wouldn't really be too concerned with this. But a lot of the stuff I'm going to present today would apply to any kind of travel or any kind of activity. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about risk management, risk assessment. It's something that I used to do back before I became a full-time photographer and travel advisor. I actually worked a risk management team for a large corporation. So I know a little bit about risk and how we have to think about it. And sometimes it can be messy and challenging and a little bit psychologically overwhelming. So I hope you enjoy the stuff that I put together, and I'll be sharing some of my photos from travel because I am a photographer. Most of you know me through that occupation that I've been doing since 2010. And so here's a wonderful photograph that I took in Ireland in 2018 when we did a tour of Ireland, and it was a fabulous adventure for myself and my photography clients. And there's a quote that I found. It says, travel is the one thing that you can buy that makes you richer. And I think that's so true. Most of the time, there's just no substitute for the experience we get while traveling, especially internationally, but even domestically. Traveling and seeing other parts of our own country or other cultures and other countries, exploring the food, exploring the architecture, whether you do it as part of a vacation or a travel group or like one of my photography groups, it is something that when you come home from, you are just better off for having had those experiences. It's a wonderful thing to do. And we all love traveling. And we've all been kind of frustrated over the last couple of years because it's been a little bit intimidating to try to travel. And we have to balance this idea of going out and traveling with this idea that, it's true. Fear is temporary. Your regrets are forever. Okay, that's true. I mean, you have to balance the risk of an activity with what you miss out by not having that activity while trying to maintain some semblance of rational safety. I mean, you can't be out there reckless, and that goes for any kind of travel. I mean, I wouldn't recommend skydiving off of jumping off the side of the Grand Canyon. Some people might really like that kind of activity, but that's a risk that I'm not willing to take on and accept. Okay, so what can we talk about? Well, let's just talk about understanding risk in a general sense, because this is where we get bombarded with so many things every day that we sometimes just get overwhelmed. So I want to put on my risk management hat from back in 2009, 2008, when I was working for a large corporation and I was helping the program management office work with all of our different departments to manage risks to our program. So risk is just this probability or a chance that something that we do, an action, an activity, a project, whatever we do on our part will lead to some kind of undesirable result. Now, those results could be, minor. Those results could be really bad, injury or death. And we subconsciously are always processing risks in our brain. We're managing risks every time we wake up in the morning. Okay, is this cup of coffee going to be bad for my health? I don't know. The risk of that versus the risk of me not being able to function as an adult without coffee. Okay, these are all things we have to sit around and process, and most of the time we just don't even consciously think about them. But being able to rationally, and that's the key part, rationally assess and manage risk is a critical life skill, and it's one that's really, sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's less obvious. So there's a bunch of ways to manage risks, and these are the kinds of things that you'll find in any kind of corporate documentation on risk. But the first thing you have to do in this process is identify the risk, what it might be, and then you need to analyze that risk. In other words, you have to assess the severity of the negative outcome. How probable is this event or this unlikely outcome to happen, and how bad will it be if it does happen? And once you know that, you can start taking actions on your own part to try to manage those risks. Now, there's lots of ways to manage risks. One way would be to just simply eliminate it altogether. If you could just make that go away, well, then, hey, there's no risk anymore. Problem solved. Other times, we simply try to avoid the risks by taking different courses of action. And other times, we'll take certain actions to either mitigate or reduce the severity of that risk, reduce the likelihood of it occurring, and reduce the likelihood of a bad outcome if it does come to fruition. These are all things we do every day in our normal lives. And then the last thing sometimes people will do, and this is actually valid, is just simply accept the risk. If you look at a risk of some kind of action on your part and say, you know what, that's so remote and so unlikely, or the outcome is so minor that I'm just going to live with it. I'm okay with that. And that's a totally valid method of risk management. But that second step on my list here, this analysis portion, where you have to assess the severity and as well as the probability of something occurring, that's where sometimes as humans we get messed up because we get all these inputs coming in. So let me just talk about some examples of risks that we might take in our everyday lives. So for example, driving above the speed limit. Is there a risk associated with that? Well, of course there is. And the biggest risk that most people would think of, aside from the safety risks, would be, you could get a ticket. If you get busted going over the speed limit, you can get a ticket. You're going to owe some money. There's a financial risk to this, and your insurance rates might go up. And if you're really speeding, I mean, you could risk losing your driver's license, right? There's all kinds of risks associated with speeding. Okay. So what do? We can handle that risk in a variety of ways. Our solutions to this would be one, hey, just don't drive over the speed limit. That's eliminating the risk altogether, right? If you set your cruise control at below the speed limit or at the speed limit, and you're really careful about the way you drive, then your risk of getting a ticket for speeding is pretty much eliminated, at least in a normal world, right? On the other hand, you could just choose to reduce your risk. I'm going to drive above the speed limit, but I'm going to keep it to levels that I think are safe. Most police probably aren't going to pull me over for going 5 miles or 8 miles over the limit on a busy freeway. I'm going to use my cruise control, and on the off chance that I did get a ticket, it wouldn't be a severe fine because I wouldn't be going very fast at all. Or you could take another mitigation approach. Say, you know what? I really like driving over the speed limit, so I'm going to buy a radar detector. I'm going to put it in my car so that I get a warning as to when the police might be using radar to look for speeding, so that I can slow down proactively and try to avoid getting that ticket in the first place. So that's an example of a risk. But they go even farther than that. Let's take another example. Just simply the act of driving your car is risky, right? You're driving a 3,000 or 4,000 pound vehicle at 60, 70, 80 miles an hour. And there's a huge risk there of injury or death if you crash, if you collide with something or another vehicle. And this is not good. So what can you do to avoid this or prevent this risk of injury or death? Well, one solution might be you just stay at home and you never drive. That would eliminate the risk of dying in a car accident, wouldn't it? But it seems unrealistic, doesn't it? Because we have to balance the risk of inaction versus the risk of taking the action. So if we are so, not gonna, we say, you know what, there's not really a good situation here where I can't drive. I need to go to the grocery store and get groceries, or I need to, well, I guess now we can use delivery services, right? Because we've learned about COVID. But in general, if you never drive, yes, you eliminate the risk of injury or death in a car, but you're also risking not getting your daily needs met. So what are the things that we do? Well, you could just avoid driving a car. You could take public transportation. I suppose that may be an option for you. Or you could say, you know what, I'm going to accept the risk that there's risks inherent in driving, but I'm going to try to mitigate that and risk of injury by wearing a seatbelt, by getting a car that has modern safety features like airbags or collision avoidance detection and all kinds of crazy new features that they have. And and automakers are building cars now with designed for crumple zones so that if you are in an accident, the likelihood of an injury is significantly reduced. And you're going to drive smart. So you're going to do all of these things because you realize that the risk of driving that can be reduced by having these safety features to a point where we're willing to accept that reduced risk in order to use the method of transportation or undertake the activity that we're interested in the first place. Okay, so this is a silly example, but these risks are around us every day, and every day we're processing these things and trying to figure out what can we do to be safe, or what can we do to just lower the chance of occurrence or reduce the negativity of a particular outcome to a reasonable level so that the benefits outweigh the risks. Okay, so in every case, no matter what we do, you have to attempt to properly assess the risk of your activities and then figure out how we can eliminate, reduce, or avoid the negative outcomes to the point where they're tolerable. They'll never go away, but we can reduce them to a point where they're unlikely to occur, or in the chance that it does occur, the impact is minimal to, the detriment is low. Okay, so you always have to consider the risk of an activity with the risk of not conducting the activity. There's certain things where you're just, now travel is a funny thing because travel is definitely a risky activity, but it's one that most of us are willing to take some risks in order to enjoy because we want to travel. We want to see the world, and the benefits of travel, like I said in the beginning, are huge, right? I mean, experiencing other cultures, the photographs that you're going to come back with, the experience of sharing your vacation with your family or your friends. These are important things to us as humans, and we really like to do them. But with any type of thing, there's always a risk. You could get injured on a trip. You could get sick on a trip. You could get, your cameras could get stolen, or you could lose your wallet, right? There's always risks when you're traveling. Heck, just getting to the airport represents a risk of traveling, right? At some point, we have to start balancing this with what is safe and what is realistic and what can we do to be smart. And this is the part where I'm here to talk about the kinds of things to be smart. And we are dealing now with a completely different time. 3 years ago, this was not a big deal, but now we're traveling, or we want to travel, in the age of COVID. And, we have to assess the risk, and the risks are different from 2020 versus today. Okay. And I think that's one of the things that we have to think about. It's still there, but the risks have changed because now we have things like vaccines and testing, and you can choose the type of vacation or travel that you want to do. Are you going with a group? Is it going to be a lot of indoor activities? Are you going to concerts overseas? What are you doing? What are the risks? And those risks are different. So in 2020, when this thing showed up, the risks were really bad outcomes because the risk of catching COVID, for example, unlike getting a cold or a flu while you're traveling, was a health risk. You could be in the hospital for weeks. You could die. I mean, this is not, that outcome is pretty strong. And when the outcome of, the negative outcome is that significant, then you have to look at what the best way to mitigate that. And before there were vaccines and tests, the only way we could really mitigate that severe risk was to stay home. I mean, that was just it. You could try to travel, but the mitigations to reduce that risk just didn't exist. Now, today, where are we? Well, if you're like me, you've been vaccinated and boosted. And the risk has shifted. Can you still get sick from COVID? Absolutely. I'm not suggesting that there's no risk there, but the risk of significant negative health outcome for most of us is not what it was 2 years ago. The risk now, from a travel perspective, has shifted from being a health risk to being a financial risk. What do I mean? You might have to cancel your trip if you get sick. If you get sick with COVID, you're unable to travel. Okay, nobody wants to be sick, and you certainly don't want to be, spreading a potentially nasty disease to your friends and family. What if you get sick during your trip? There's risks of having to isolate or quarantine, or you might risk getting stuck in another country, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, because these are all real, honest to goodness concerns. They are not small things, but these concerns are easier to mitigate because these are more financial risks than straight up health risks. Okay. The health risk is not the same provided that you have gotten your COVID vaccines. Okay. So if you're going to travel, for example, internationally, there's things you can do that you need to be aware of. Are there entry requirements now? Most countries require you to show proof of vaccination in order to enter, meaning you're going to be vaccinated and the people who you're traveling with will also be vaccinated. Okay. Some countries, although this is changing and not as prevalent anymore, there was a time when testing would be required. You had to show proof of a negative COVID test to enter a country, meaning if you're going on this trip, you have a negative test, you know it's not infallible, but you know that you and your traveling companions, at least at that time, were not sick with COVID. And so that's a good thing. There could also be re-entry requirements. So the US currently requires a negative test within 24 hours of boarding your flight to get back in the country. But hey, as of this morning, literally breaking news today, that testing for air travel return to the US is not going to be required as of Sunday. So June 12th, that requirement, which has been in place since January of 2020, I believe, or 21, I can't remember exactly. Yeah, January of 21, that requirement is getting dropped. So this huge barrier of, oh my gosh, what if I get stuck? It just got lowered. Okay, so that's great news for people who are interested in traveling abroad, because I know that a lot of us have this fear of getting stuck overseas and having to quarantine. So what is safe, right? We want to go and we want to travel, but we don't want to be stupid. At the same time, I mean, we want to be smart about it. We understand there's some risks, but we don't want to do stuff that prevents us from either traveling or certainly prevents us from enjoying our vacation. I mean, what's the point of going somewhere if you're going to be freaked out all the time, right? Not good. So you got to be smart and you got to be safe. So individual travel, if you're just going by yourself, that's pretty darn safe. Okay, if you avoid groups altogether, and you stay in an Airbnb and you just travel in your car, well, or RV, whatever, hey, that's pretty safe. But that's not what everyone is going to do. You're probably never going to have a trip where you don't encounter others. Okay, so it's a little bit unrealistic to think that you're going to travel individually in a bubble the whole time. But if you go on a group tour or any kind of activity that requires proof of vaccination for everyone and combines that with a negative COVID test to start your vacation, that's awfully safe. Not perfect, not 100% ironclad, but it's awfully safe because now you know that the people that you're with are kind of in this bubble of people who are vaccinated and tested negative. So it takes out some of that uncertainty of being in groups of strangers because you know that everyone tested. Smaller groups are usually safer than larger groups, but that's, again, it depends on what the requirements are for traveling. Okay. So one thing I get all the time, everyone wants to freak out about cruising. My gosh, I'll never get on a cruise ship. Is that safe? Well, I'm the irony here is that the cruise industry, which got hammered for obvious reasons during the big COVID. I mean, they shut down their entire industry practically for 2 years because nobody wants to get sick on a cruise ship confined with others where it might spread around, right? This is one of those latent fears that we have about cruising. But ironically, cruises are one of the safest things you can do right now. And I've been on 2 this spring with no problem whatsoever. And the reason is that at the current, state, in order for you to get on that ship, you have to have proof of vaccination if you're of age. Okay. And if you aren't vaccinated, the only exceptions are for kids 12 and under, and they have to get tested periodically during the cruise. And you have to present a negative COVID test in order to get on that ship. Now, they also have this interesting bypass because you're coming back to the US. Most cruises include an international destination. Testing isn't required to get back to the US if you're coming from overseas on a ship. This testing requirement was only for air travel. Okay, and like I said, that's now going to be moot because they're dropping that requirement as of Sunday. So I've been on 2 cruises. This is a photo I took on the Queen Mary 2 transatlantic cruise, all the way a week from New York to Southampton. And we had a great time. We weren't, we followed instructions. There were some mask requirements, but nobody in, my group got sick. It was wonderful. And I also took a cruise to down to the Caribbean, to the Yucatan, to Mexico. Also no problem. And again, I felt pretty comfortable on the cruise ships because I knew that everybody had been tested and vaccinated before we even got on board. And you can't say that about all kinds of travel. So let's talk about mitigating your travel risk, because there's all kinds of things you have to be aware of. I mean, you think about pickpockets. We worry about getting stuck. We worry about getting sick or injured. And, nobody wants that to happen to them. No matter where you're going, okay, internationally or domestic. So we got to travel smart. So let's think about a trip now where you are going to go overseas, where you have to potentially get tested to travel, okay? Because nobody wants to get sick when they're, any kind of illness when you're traveling. Well, you're probably a lot more aware of risky conditions when you're actually on your vacation, like crowds and eating indoors or doing whatever, then you are really thinking about when you're at home. I mean, this is absolutely true, right? So one thing to do is consider not locking yourself down, but a week or so before you travel, you really need to think about limiting your indoor activities, the number of times you might be going out, because probably here in the US, transmission of things like COVID is higher than a lot of other countries, which have higher vaccination rates than we do. So if you're smart on the front end before you even go, you're reducing the likelihood that you come down with any kind of illness, for that matter, during your trip. Okay. If you're going to go on a cruise, for example, okay, they'll require you to take a test 48 hours in advance. And there's 3 kinds of tests that are acceptable. There's the traditional PCR tests, which take a long time. Those are the ones that sometimes take 48 hours to come back. They're slow. There's the antigen tests, which are the ones you can do even at home if you just got to get the right kind of test that's approved for travel. And then there's a test called a NAAT. That's a nucleic acid amplification test. Now, those are rapid PCR tests. And these are actually the best ones you can do before you get on, say, a cruise. And the reason is that they're more sensitive. And while nobody wants to test positive, I don't know what's worse: canceling my trip because I got sick and getting potentially reimbursed, and travel credit and being able to do it later, or coming down and having to be isolated on my cruise or on my vacation. I think being isolated and sick on my vacation is a worse outcome than taking travel credit or getting reimbursed from maybe an insurance policy. So that NAAT test is the one that I choose when I go on a cruise, because they can turn it around usually within an hour or two, and it's more sensitive. So I'd rather know up front that I might be, sick but asymptomatic, than find out 2 days later that I come down with COVID on a trip, right? That would suck. And then when I'm in town, let's just be clear, people talk about masking, but nowadays we know that a cloth mask is kind of just, decorative. So I keep N95 masks around, not for, everyday stuff, but but that week before I'm going to travel, I'm making sure that I'm masking up at Costco or in the grocery store just because I can choose to do that. And I'm going to use a good mask. I'm going to wear that mask in the airport. I'm going to wear that mask on public transportation so that when I finally get to my destination, I've done the best I can to protect myself and I can enjoy my vacation in the way that I wanted to and take pictures. The other thing you can do, and this I cannot stress enough now, is to carry travel insurance. This is not something I ever really thought about 10 years ago. But today I will not go anywhere without travel insurance. Okay. And and the reason is that you used to just think, well, travel insurance is just to cover if I have to cancel my trip. Well, that's true. It will cover your non-refundable expenses. Although consider that if you had to cancel a flight or a vacation tour due to illness, a lot of times you will get either credits or refunds. So just look to see what your provider has for their refund policy should you have to cancel due to an illness. But the travel insurance will cover your medical expenses during your trip. It can cover unexpected costs if you have to remain overseas due to some kind of quarantine or isolation. Again, that's a big worry that a lot of my clients have. If you know that your travel insurance will cover the cost of those additional hotel nights and meals, then yeah, it's still a pain, but at least you are covering your financial risk by not getting, exposed to having to spend an extra week in a hotel somewhere and have to pay for that all out of your own pocket. It's really the only way to truly protect the investment you make on your travel experience on your vacation. So, the good news is that all of the travel insurance companies that I work with in my role as a travel advisor, they're all improving their coverage to cover the quarantines or COVID related expenses. They're just including that. So it's something that you want to look at. There's policies that cover different things, but you want to find a travel policy that would cover those expenses. And the ones that we offer at Dancing Moon Travel definitely do that, so you would want to read the fine print. And again, I'm just going to conclude with this whole idea of balancing the risk equation. We take all kinds of measures to protect ourselves. We worry about pickpockets. We put stuff in our safes. We don't travel alone. We travel with a group. We don't go to areas where we're considered risky. We now have to layer on top of that, getting sick. Everyone's going to have your own personal limits of what is acceptable amount of risk for any kind of activity. I'm not here to tell you that there's no risks involved with anything. I'm here to say we all have our own view of risk. Okay. We have to take that view with the information that is available to us at the current time. And I think it's easy to think back to where we were, a year or two ago when things were just really off the rails. So COVID is still out there. It's not going away. I'd love to say we can eliminate the risk of COVID by just flipping the switch and having COVID disappear. That's not going to happen. I think it's pretty clear that it's a serious concern. It's a real thing. Okay. But today, assuming that you've been vaccinated and especially if you've been boosted, the risk of COVID becomes more of a financial risk of a disruptor to your trip than the health risk that it was in 2020. I mean, I'm not going to dismiss it, but I'm going to say that for most of us, the risk of health has been mitigated by getting vaccinated, and you can further bump that up by using good masks and doing that the kind of smart behaviors when you're traveling. You've got to weigh the risk of traveling and get it, and what those risks are, and there's a million of them, with the risk of what you're missing out by not traveling. Okay. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, we do want to do things, and let's face it. Every time we put off stuff, you're risking not being able to do it. You don't know what health conditions you might encounter a year or two from now. It's absolutely true. And I want to, so I want to encourage everybody that we can travel safely. There is a way to do it. And especially now, if you take the necessary precautions by you know, being vaccinated, traveling smart, knowing the requirements, and most importantly, getting a travel insurance policy that you're not surprised by. Read the fine print. I had a client come with me on a photo trip a couple of years ago. I got some insurance stories to share. We went to Arches National Park in Canyonlands, and I had this great client of mine. She's wonderful. But we were hiking down the trail to go to Mesa Arch before sunrise. So we were there at 5 a.m. The sun was, it was still dark out. And she kind of got enamored by looking at this Milky Way because you could see all the stars. And she took a bad step and she turned out both of her ankles. I got her back. I took her to the emergency room. She was fine, but she got x-rayed. She had minor fractures in both of her ankles. And she said to me, well, don't worry, it's okay because I have insurance through something, my credit card or something like that. I said, okay, no worries. Well, what happened? Well, it turned out that when she went to get reimbursed and, because all this extra travel, she had a rental car to return. It was a big pain. Her insurance company denied her claim. And they denied her claim because they pointed to the fine print that says, we will cover your medical emergency if you are admitted to a hospital. But because she was only going to an ER and not actually admitted to a hospital, they refused to cover anything. And from that point on, she's always then chosen to get an honest to God travel policy that covers these kinds of things, regardless of the circumstance. Okay. Now I'll give you another example. And this unfortunately happened to my parents just this year. They planned a trip to go to Antarctica. And that's not a small undertaking. And it's certainly not an inexpensive undertaking. And they had planned that trip to go for February of 2021. And as you might imagine, that whole trip got canceled due to the COVID, right? So they got rebooked and everything. And here they were. The day that they were flying down to Chile from here in Colorado, we had an awful storm. Now, the good news was that the storm did not impact operations at the airport. The bad news was that United had some mechanical problems with their flight. And it turned out that by the time their flight took off, it was so late, they were going to miss their connection to get the only flight from Houston to Chile. And there was no way around it. We went through every possible thing. Now, they had insurance, and while it took a little while, they had to do a lot of paperwork. They got the full amount of their trip refunded to them because by the time they had canceled, it was not due to illness or anything like that. They were inside the cancellation window for the cruise, for the expedition. They got every penny back because they had a good travel insurance policy that we had set up for them. So what are some of the things that I'm offering to come up, if you do want to travel? Like I said, it's we're in a weird time, but I think you can do it right. So my primary travel advisor at Dancing Moon Travel has chartered a yacht to take us on the Dalmatian coast of Croatia this August. It's an amazing thing. And again, vaccination is required. Everybody on board will be tested, but remember I said small groups are safer. So we're going to be in our little bubble. This ship it's a yacht. It only has 30, 15 cabins. So we're talking 30 people in a bubble to go explore islands off the coast of Croatia. I did it last October. It was totally safe and it was an amazing trip. And I'll be offering a photo workshop for people who are interested in doing some photography on that trip. I'm personally offering a travel photography cruise to New England this September, the end of September, for fall colors. I'm keeping my fingers crossed. I say that in parentheses. But we're going to sail from Quebec City back to Boston. Now, again, on a ship, you don't need to test to re-enter the US. And again, we'll be coming back to a US port, so flying home, we won't have any problems on that. And that should be really epic because we're going to Halifax and Peggy's Cove and, Nova Scotia and all those places that are really hard to get to if you're not on a ship. I'm also offering a travel photography workshop in Santa Fe, New Mexico in October with my buddy Rick Walker. We're doing it as a small group travel workshop. Of course, you might just want to do your own adventure. So back in 2020, I was actually beginning to put together the workings of a travel agency business as an independent contractor to my primary travel agent, Pat Hand at Dancing Moon Travel. And you all know what happened in March of 2020. Things just didn't get off the ground. However, I am still fully connected to the system, and I am able to help you if you want to do your own adventure. So if you want to go on a vacation this fall, contact me. I have my travel agent email address is down there at the bottom, jason@dancingmoontravel.com. And I'd be happy to work with you. Or if you've already got a trip and you want to talk about insurance or any of these things, let me know. I'm here. I'm working. It's fun. You can do it right if you take the right precautions. So with that, I'm opening it up to any questions that you guys might have.